Good afternoon, everyone. My name is John Hamre. I am the president of the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and we welcome all of you today for a remarkable session that we will have with two Supreme Court justices, Justice Gorsuch and Justice Sotomayor. This is part of a series that CSIS has been sponsoring during this past year on the importance of civics education as a national security imperative. For this session today, we're very pleased that we are partnering with the National Security Institute, which is at George Mason University's Scalia School, Law School. But we also have partnership with the American Bar Association, with iCivics, and George Mason's Liberty and Law Center. And we're very pleased that we can offer this to you today because of the conditions that we have with COVID these days. Everything is going to be recorded, but you're going to have the opportunity to listen into a very important conversation with these two leaders of the Supreme Court. We've had a challenging several set of years. I mean, and lots of questions that have come up. When we had governors and mayors closing down operations of restaurants and hotels, et cetera, for the first time in 100 years, America had to think about things like quarantine again. And then, of course, we've had an election that was very tumultuous, lots of questioning about the legitimacy of the election, big issues. And so civics education has come to the forefront again. And we're going to have a very important conversation today. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to having you join us again for future things, but enjoy this very important session.
Hi, I'm Ken Randall, Dean of the Scalia Law School at George Mason University. Today's program is being co-sponsored by the National Security Institute, the NSI, here at Scalia George Mason, and by the Center for Strategic and International Studies. The Scalia Law School is honored to be part of this program. Our namesake, Justice Antonin Scalia, believes strongly in the importance of civics education. In 2014 remarks in a speech in Chicago about civic education, Justice Scalia quoted the 18th century educator Noah Webster, and I quote, "American students must know and love the laws. This knowledge should be diffused by schools and by newspapers. An attachment to the laws may be formed by early impressions on the mind." Civics education is critical in the national security field. It teaches the citizenry about the rule of law. Civic education is fundamental to the justice system and why justice is essential to securing American democracy. We are honored today that two members of the United States Supreme Court, Justices Sonia Sotomayor and Neil Gorsuch, will discuss and share their insights about the state of civics education today, civics and national security, the role of courts in democracy and maintaining the public trust, and courts and civic education. Thank you for joining this special fireside chat. It will be moderated by Professor Jamil Jaffer, Executive Director of the NSI, and by Suzanne Spaulding, Director of the Defending Democratic Institutions Project. We hope you enjoy our program.
Thank you, Dean Randall and Dr. Hamre, for those opening remarks and for your support for this important co-hosted program. I am Suzanne Spaulding, Senior Advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, where I lead the Defending Democratic Institutions Project. As Dr. Hamre noted, for the past year, we at CSIS have been engaged in a strategic dialogue on civics as a national security imperative. We've had a number of programs that can be found on our website at csis.org. Today, Jamil Jaffer and I have the honor of talking with our most distinguished guests. I have the pleasure of introducing Justice Sonia Sotomayor, and will then turn to my friend Jamil to introduce Justice Gorsuch. Justice Sonia Sotomayor was born in Bronx, New York, and was sworn in as an Associate Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court on August 8, 2009. That remarkable story is chronicled in books she has written for people of all ages. I will focus here on her professional career. After graduating summa cum laude from Princeton University, receiving the university's highest academic honor, she went on to Yale Law School, where she served as an editor of the Yale Law Journal, and she earned her JD in 1979. She then served as assistant district attorney in the New York County District Attorney's Office until 1994, and subsequently litigated international commercial matters in New York City as an associate and then a partner at the law firm of Pavia and Harcourt. In 1991, President George H.W. Bush nominated her to the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York. She moved up to become a judge on the United States Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit in 1998. And on May 26, 2009, President Barack Obama nominated her as an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court. In addition to her service on the court, Justice Sotomayor is an active board member of iCivics, an organization dedicated to promoting civic education in America. It was founded by Justice Sandra Day O'Connor as she stepped down from the bench. We are thrilled to have Justice Sotomayor join us today. Jamil, over to you.
Thanks, Suzanne. I'm Jamil Jaffer, and I'm the founder and executive director of the National Security Institute at George Mason University's Antonin Scalia Law School. I'm extremely pleased that NSI is co-hosting this event with CSIS, and that I had the honor of introducing my former boss, Justice Neil Gorsuch. Justice Gorsuch is a native of the great state of Colorado, where he grew up a skier and an avid fly fisherman, interests he still pursues to this day. Justice Gorsuch went to Columbia University, Harvard Law School, and obtained his doctorate from Oxford University. He went on to serve as a trial litigator at the storied firm of Kellogg Huber and served in the Justice Department as Principal Deputy Associate Attorney General. He then was appointed to and confirmed unanimously by the United States Senate to serve as a judge of the United States Court of Appeals for the 10th Circuit in Denver, Colorado, his home state, where I had the honor of being one of his first law clerks. In 2017, Justice Gorsuch was nominated and confirmed to the United States Supreme Court, where he serves today. I'm thrilled to be here with him and Justice Sotomayor and to have what promises to be a terrific conversation. Suzanne, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Jamil. So I am going to pose this first question to Justice Sotomayor, but Justice Gorsuch, we hope to hear your thoughts on this as well. We've been going through a very tumultuous time in this country, particularly over the past year, with people isolated during the COVID-19 pandemic and economically stretched, and with high levels of discord in American politics and in communities across the nation. How should we think about the importance of civic education and engagement at this moment in America?
This is the scariest of times and the most exciting of times. I see the civil discourse as having many benefits. It's getting people engaged who otherwise haven't been. We had one of the highest turnouts in voting the last election. Yet at the same time, we see some of the cracks in our system. We have a great deal of partisan, very heated debate going on. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it can turn into an awful thing, into something that destroys the fabric of our community if we don't learn how to talk to each other, how to discuss things with each other, and how to change things in a positive rather than in a negative way. And that's what civic participation is about. That's what civic education is about. It's about teaching people about our institutions, about their importance, their strengths, and their fragility, and engaging people in being active participants in change with knowledge and with passion, but without hatred. And I say that because too much of our conversation in our nation is centered on the negative and too little on the positive of what we share in common. And so for me, this issue of civics is so critically important in this time in our history.
Well, you want me to chime in now, Suzanne?
That would be great. Thank you.
You know, Sonia and I care deeply about this issue, and we talk, both of us, a lot about it. And we do, I think, because we share a common conviction. And I don't want to speak for you, Sonia, but I think on this one, we probably agree that you have to ask yourself, how can it—
We don't agree that often on things, so this
not
is.
on other things, but this one we how can a democracy function if we can't talk to one another? And if we can't disagree kindly, with respect for one another's differences and different points of view? I think our court is a pretty good example of how democracy is supposed to work. You have people from all across the country with radically different life experiences and different points of view, but all of whom share a love for this country and a love for our Constitution. And more than that, really love one another and respect one another and listen to one another. And you ask, how should we think about it? The question of civics in this day and age. And I think the question is an enduring one. We've had strife from the beginning of the Republic. Any student watching this who's seen Hamilton can recall some incidents in our early history that show some examples of where disagreement got out of hand. But the fact of the matter is, if we're going to endure, if this Constitution of ours is going to make it work over time, we're already the oldest living republic in the world, in history. And if that's going to continue to work, it's going to take work from all of us, and recognizing that all of us love this country and that we're not coming at it to hurt one another, but to work together with one another to make this a better place.
Great. Well, both of you talked a bit about the challenges and opportunities, the causes for concern and the signs of hope in our society today. Specifically with respect to the state of civics education, and civic literacy, where do you see signs of concern and signs of hope today in our country? And I'll again ask Justice Sotomayor to start and Justice Gorsuch to chime in.
There's a number of studies out there, recent studies, that of a great concern. One of them showed that only 1 of 5 Americans could name a right protected by the First Amendment. That's a bit scary. Similarly, we have studies that show that there is a percentage, about a quarter of our young population, who don't believe democracy is a good thing. Those are statistics that should raise concern. As Justice Gorsuch said, we're the oldest living democracy. But if we have that large a part of our population not basically understanding the importance of our institution, how do we make it survive? And right now, there are many, many organizations and people, your organization included, Suzanne, who are actively involved in educating on civics. But we fall very short from what we need to do. Right now, on every student, we spend $50 in teaching STEM courses. We spend a nickel, 5 cents, in teaching civics. Now, I don't know whether the disparity should be that large or how much closer we should come to equalizing the two. But the disparity, given the reports of how little our students know about civics, should be a point of concern for everyone. You can't save our democracy unless you understand it, have knowledge about it, and know what you can do. And so for me, civic education is a priority because I understand how critical it is to our survival.
Yeah, I don't know how you want to change things or affect change if you don't know how the system works. And Sonia gave some of the examples of the statistics that are really just shocking these days. There are so many others. Turns out only about 1/3 of people today can name the 3 branches of our government. 10% of people apparently believe that Judith Sheindlin serves on the Supreme Court with Justice Sotomayor and myself. People may better know her as Judge Judy. And I love Judge Judy, but she is not one of our colleagues. And if you don't know how it works, you're never going to change it in ways that you want to make it better. Are there reasons for hope? Yes. I am fundamentally optimistic about this country because whatever our problems are, they are problems that are solvable by people of goodwill. And there are so many people out there trying to do something about this. Sonia's organization, iCivics, founded by Justice O'Connor, is one wonderful organization. And if some of the people watching want to go online and check it out, you can play video games that teach you about the Constitution. And Justice Sotomayor and I have actually played some of those games with fifth graders. They're fantastic and they're fun. There are other organizations too, like yours, Suzanne, yours, Jamil, that are working on this and recognize that this is a national security imperative. It's not just a teaching issue. The Constitution Center in Philadelphia, as well, is another resource for a lot of teachers and students that I just think is marvelous what they've put online in teaching about the Constitution. They take every part of the Constitution and they bring together people of different perspectives to talk about what they agree on and what they disagree on about the Constitution. And it's just a wonderful opportunity to learn from some of the brightest people who thought the most deeply about our Constitution anywhere in the country, available very easy terms for middle schoolers and high schoolers to understand and to really engage with. So those are some of the things that make me optimistic. People like you who are trying to make things better. So thank you for what you're doing.
There's one other resource I would mention. Civics Now
Yes.
is a consortium of many, many organizations, I think over 162, if I'm not wrong, committed to civic education. And their website provides an enormous amount of varied information about different ways to access civic education topics. And so I encourage people to visit that website if they want to be involved.
You know, Justice Gorsuch, one of the things that you mentioned in your remarks was this idea that the American people, a lot of Americans don't know what the three branches of our government are or who's on the Supreme Court of the United States. And as we think about a robust civics education, what are those sort of fundamental elements of our democracy? What are those rule of law institutions and concepts that really a particularly robust civics education would impart to our young people?
Well, I think part of what I'd like to see young people understand more is that they can be part of a system to make change. Let me give you an example. There's a young man named Gregory Watson who was a student in college, and he was asked to write about the Bill of Rights. And he wrote a paper saying that there was this constitutional amendment that James Madison had written way back when to be part of the Bill of Rights, but it never got fully adopted. A lot of states had ratified it, but not all of them. And he wrote a paper saying, I think that could still become part of the Constitution today. This is a teenager, maybe 20 years old, right? And the teacher gave him a C. And that C made him mad. So what did he do? He got involved. And he started writing state legislatures across the country himself, saying, you ought to take a look at this thing that Madison wrote way back when. And you guys ought to ratify it. It's really good. And in 1992, it became the 27th Amendment to the United States Constitution, thanks to Gregory Watson. Well, that teacher, that may have been the most consequential C that a teacher ever awarded. And to the teacher's credit, the teacher later upgraded it to an A. That's what I'd like young people to understand, is that this is their democracy. It's we the people, and they can do these things.
Justice Sotomayor?
Jamil, we don't have a right to be bystanders. If that's what you choose to become in our society, it's by your own choice. Because things shouldn't just happen to us. You don't stand on a street corner and let a bus hit you. You try to get out of the way. And for me, that's what civic education should be focused on. You need knowledge about what the system is, what its purpose is about, how it fits together, what it's trying to accomplish. Those are the sort of basics, ABC, that kids have to learn in civic education. But then they have to learn, more importantly, what is it that I can do? What are my responsibilities in this system? Because we all benefit in ways we don't realize. I use a very common example for kids. What are laws about? They're an attempt to accommodate competing interests. What's the simplest law you know? Crossing the street. Laws about crossing the street. You stop at a red, you go on a green. You do that because the law tells you that's what you're supposed to do. And the competing interests there are that every one of us would like to go on red too, because we would get to where we're going faster. But we're willing to give up a little bit of our time because it helps generally more of us to get to where we're going safely. And that's what law is about. That's what our civic structure is about. Trying to let us live together in a more harmonious way. It's imperfect. We don't have endless resources, but we can't make our union a more perfect union unless people are actively participating. And so, like Justice Gorsuch, I believe that that's the purpose of civic education. Not merely to teach the structure, the three branches of government, and who's on the Supreme Court. Those are facts. And some of them, like who's on the Supreme Court, change over time. But I do want people to understand what the purpose is of our democracy and what the purpose is of our three branches of government. Because if you know what it's about, you can make changes.
You know, Justice Sotomayor, as we think about the purpose of our government and the role, as you point out, that individuals have to play and must play, it's their duty in some sense. How do you think about the impact of a strong civic education and civic engagement by the population on our national security? What is the relationship between understanding your government, being involved in your government, and the security of the nation when it comes to these issues?
You know, another recent study has said that 18% of Americans believe that army rule of our country would be a good thing. Now, pause a minute, because if there are people in the audience who agree with that statement, then we're in real danger. And so for me, unless we know about our democracy, understand its importance, then we can't appreciate the threats to it. You know, there's another recent study that says that 70% of falsehoods get spread on Twitter. That is frightening, isn't it? That people don't learn about truthful statements as much as false statements through social media. That is the real threat to our national security. When we don't understand what threatens it. And so for me, the two are so intimately tied together. Our democracy is at risk, not only from foreign, but from domestic enemies. And Neil's and my oath of office require us to protect our Constitution from foreign and domestic enemies alike.
Justice Gorsuch, thoughts on the connection between sort of civic understanding, civic engagement, and our national security?
Yeah, Jamil. Well, you know, if you look back through history, how did democracies die? They don't tend to last long in history, and they don't tend to fall apart because they've been subject to invasion. They fall apart from within. They crumble, and there becomes a hunger for a certain faction to take over because they're intolerant of others. They think they know the right answer and that others do not, and that it is time for us to impose our will on others rather than to work together and to resolve our differences through lawful processes. And Sonia's given you a couple of figures, and I may have mentioned one, but the one that really strikes me is only about a third of young Americans think it's important to live in a democracy. And that is a national security concern. And the concern, I agree with Sonia, it is less, I'm less concerned in some ways about foreign enemies. We must always be concerned about them. But the topic we're talking about is internal. And if we don't care about living in a democracy, if we don't tend to the garden of democracy and the conditions that make it ripe, it's not an automatic thing. And our enemies know this, even if we don't. And it is no surprise that a lot of the false information spread on social media is deliberately spread by our enemies to sow disagreement internally in the country. And there the numbers are really shocking, as you both know. And if we allow them to destroy our sense of we the people, our sense of community, our sense of our shared liberties that we love and treasure, that's hard to come back from. And so when I think of civics, I also put in there another word that's kind of another bad word, right? Civics become kind of a, Sonia's pointed out rightly, it's kind of become a bad word. We want to talk about the STEM classes. Another bad word has become civility. And we've also stopped teaching, I call it, ways to get along with one another, manners, kindness, listening, tolerance. Those have become bad words. And I am very concerned that if we can't learn to live with one another, tolerate our disagreements, and recognize my rights that I cherish, you cherish yours. And we may see things very differently, but at the end of the day, we're in this together. So I see it as a serious national security threat, Jamil. And that's why Justice Sotomayor and I think, share our passion for this topic.
So I'll pick it up from there. I'd like to pick up on both of you mentioned the threat from disinformation, information operations from sources foreign and domestic. We've certainly heard a lot about the role that foreign nation states are playing in exacerbating divisions in our nation and in undermining public trust in our democracy as a whole and in our specific democratic institutions, including in the justice system and in the rule of law. Foreign voices, nation states often are amplifying domestic voices. And of course, they're exploiting weaknesses of our own making. So talk a bit more about how damaging you think this trend is. And importantly, what can ordinary folks and maybe even judges do about this? And Justice Gorsuch, we'll start with you this time.
All right. Well, I think we all have to become critical consumers of information and recognize that a lot of the information we receive is aimed at making us angry and engaging our emotions. That's what our enemies are trying to engage. And that is a lot of what, of course, people are trying to sell something to us too, when we go online and use social media or any media. And we just need to become aware of that. And I think the other part of it is we all have to try to become our better selves and to recognize when we are acting out of emotion rather than thinking something through. And thinking something through, that means listening, not just yelling, not just talking. It means listening. It means reading the other side and the other point of view. Justice Sotomayor and I spend all our time reading briefs from both points of view, and then coming to a decision. It's, the judicial process is long and laborious, and we hear both sides. But I think if we all behave that way with respect to the information we receive, and don't just talk to the friends who say what we want to hear, but listen to our friends who may not agree with us, and take them seriously too. That's how a democracy works. The point of a democracy is to take the best of all points of view and throw them into a pot, mix them together, and then come up with laws, like Justice Sotomayor mentioned, that enable us to maximize our individual freedoms while respecting others. And that requires us to work together. That requires us to put aside our emotional responses, our initial knee-jerk responses, and to really dig in and engage with other points of view. That's what makes us strong. That's the weak part of a democracy, but it's also its beautiful and great strength.
Suzanne, one of the reasons that I think that the Supreme Court functions the way it does, and in the way that it promotes disagreement in an agreeable way, is because we all fundamentally respect each other. I know that every one of my colleagues loves the Constitution, laws, and our system of government as much as I do. They're as passionate as I am about upholding all of those things. We disagree on how to get there, but I don't start with impugning their motives. And I think a lot of what disinformation does today is start that way. I sometimes watch the news, and the news is focused on what negative things motivate people to do whatever they're doing, instead of starting with what is it the person's saying, or what have they done? What's the position they're taking? And what in good faith may make them see that as a problem? And what in good faith may have motivated their concern about an issue? If you can start there, you can often find compromise. Because if you take other views as being founded on genuine concerns and not on ill motives or bad human motives, you can actually have a conversation. And I think that that's what we're missing, that sort of social media literacy of taking facts and checking them and sort of saying, I understand what part of this problem you saw, but this sort of was left out. There's another side to this. Let's take a look and paint that picture more roundly. And I think that's what social media is about, is not taking sort of an exhortation in the media as a fact, but taking it as something to think about, research, and look at the other side before you begin to draw conclusions on what an answer might be.
And so important, particularly with regard to controversial subjects, right? And it seems like, right, and it seems like the courts really only come into the public's eye for most people when something controversial is happening, right? And so one of the questions is, what is the role of the courts? Can you help explain to our audience the role of the courts in protecting the rights and liberties of Americans? And do you think the public adequately understands this role, as well as the importance of the rule of law in our democracy? So the way that the courts operate on a day-to-day basis, not just on the controversial cases. Justice Sotomayor.
She's going to the default, Neil, and starting with I often think about that question because I start from the proposition that people don't fully understand the role of the courts. People think of justice with a capital J in the sense of what would we do, what would I do morally? If this was put before God, what judgment would he or she pass? The problem is that I think, my own humble opinion, that God is likely to be a bit more like Solomon and try to figure out what would be just situationally. But that's not what courts and judges and the law does. when cases come to us, it's an all or nothing generally. There's a winner, and the opposite of winner is there's a loser. And in that kind of adjudication, all we can say is, this is the law that was passed. This situation fits on this side of the line or that side of the line. But we're not making a moral judgment about whether that line's in the right place. That moral judgment is made by the society, by its participants, by the people who make laws, and the citizens who inform that process. And so if people really came to understanding the role of courts in that way, I think there would be less disappointment in us. Because so many people read our decisions, and when they disagree, they tend to personalize it to thinking that it is the individual judges or the court as a system that has failed them, as opposed to looking at it for what it is, a statement of what needs to be done and a need that they have to address in a different forum. And so for me, that I think is the way in which students and citizens can have a greater appreciation of what the courts are trying to do. And that fundamental misunderstanding, I think, is where we disappoint them, because we're not playing Solomon.
I think what Justice Sotomayor said is beautiful and captures it perfectly. So much of what we do is look at a statute that's got 17 subparts and try and line up the facts with which does it fit into A, B, C, or D. And if you don't like our answer, and often we don't like our answers, it's just what the law requires, then the right forum for fixing it is by we the people through the legislative process. Or you can take Gregory Watson's model and amend the Constitution. It can be done. I think when it comes to the rule of law in this country, I think we're like David Foster Wallace's fish swimming in water who doesn't even realize it because it's everywhere around him and it's so natural and we take it for granted. But as you both well know, you look around the world today and the rule of law isn't something you can take for granted. It's very rare. It's very precious. It's like democracy. It only happens in special circumstances. You know, Daniel Webster said with respect to democracy, that our democracy is the first one in 6,000 years of its kind. And you shouldn't expect things like that to happen often. And they don't happen by accident. And when I talk about the rule of law in particular in this country, I like to give a few facts that for me paint the picture, because I think everybody focuses on the few cases where Justice Sotomayor and I happen to disagree this year, okay? All right, it happens. We do it respectfully, even lovingly sometimes.
And passionately.
And passionately, and passionately. That's part of the love. That's part of the love. And, but here are the real facts about law in our culture today, Suzanne. If you look at it, there are about 50 million cases that Americans file every year in our court system. Now, there are only 330 million of us. So that's a lot. We're a pretty litigious bunch. And I'm not counting there your traffic tickets and your speeding tickets, Jamil. That's another 50 million, okay? 50 million lawsuits in this country every year. And now I know these figures from the federal system because that's where I worked before I came to this court. 95% of those cases that come into the federal courts are resolved by a judge or a jury in the trial courts and never appealed. Now, when I represented clients who lost, they weren't always happy, but they'd recognize often that they were heard and that the judge or the jury rendered a reasonable judgment. And so they don't appeal. Okay, 5% of cases make it to appellate courts, like my old court, Justice Sotomayor's old court, the Second Circuit, the 10th Circuit. There we serve in panels of 3 judges appointed by, I served with judges appointed by President Obama back to President Lyndon Baines Johnson. okay? With very diverse court, more diverse than the Supreme Court on any metric you wish to measure. And we resolved those 5% of cases that came up on appeal where somebody really thought passionately enough to appeal it. We resolved those cases unanimously 95% of the time. Only 5% were there any disagreement about the outcome, the right outcome under the rule of law in our country. I think that's pretty amazing. And then people say, okay, fine, that's the forest. Tell me about the trees, the Supreme Court, that's where the fun stuff is, right? I say, okay, but look, 95% of cases that are on appeal, which is only 5%, are resolved without any disagreement about what the rules really are. Well, the Supreme Court of the United States only hears 70 cases a year these days. We only hear cases where the lower courts have disagreed on the rule of law, where there's actual disagreement between those circuit judges on what the rule is. There are only 70 of those in our country every year. Think about that. And then within those 70, we managed to reach unanimous agreement with 9 judges, not just 3 anymore, 9. And I think we're appointed by 5 different presidents, something like that. We're from all across the country. Justice Sotomayor's from New York. I'm from Colorado. And we managed to reach unanimity 40% of the time. 40%. Now everybody says, what about those
Sometimes
5?
Higher.
What?
Sometimes
Sometimes higher, right? I'm giving you
Sometimes
that. Sometimes higher. And everybody says, what about those 5-4 decisions? Well, that's about 25% of our docket every year. And the 5-4 decisions are not all one side or the other. There were, I think, 10 different 5-4 combinations in the year before last, 10. And then I tell them, okay, you think those are interesting figures. Let me give you one more, then I'll stop, I promise. The figures at 40% of unanimity and about 25% 5-4, those are the same figures that were in place in 1945, when President Roosevelt had appointed 8 of the 9 justices on the Supreme Court of the United States, one president. And I think if we're doing as well as they did then, we ought to be pretty proud of our rule of law in this country. And we shouldn't take it for granted. And we should recognize how fortunate we are to live in a place where law is that stable. Our rights are that clear. I'll stop.
So, Justice Sotomayor, notwithstanding the numbers that Justice Gorsuch gave us and the importance of the role of the courts and understand the role of the courts in our society today, surveys tell us that a significant portion of Americans believe that judges, including on the Supreme Court, make decisions based on their own personal policy or political views, rather than applying the laws, the Constitution of the United States to the facts of the case. How important is it to reinforce the role of judges to interpret and apply the law and not decide policy or be influenced by their own personal preferences? And how do we convince the American people that that is in fact what judges are doing in their role on the courts?
I start with most audiences, Jamil, where that question is asked of me, including audiences with lawyers. I asked, how many of you have read that Supreme Court case that bothers you the most, cover to cover? And I will tell you that the number of hands that rise in any audience I pose that question to is infinitesimally small. What people tend to react to is bottom lines. Has that judge ruled in a particular way that I like? Or has he or she not? There is news coverage, and news coverage tends to do the same thing. So to focus on the outcome rather than the reasoning. And I invite most people to not get sucked up into that assumption, but to actually take the time to understand the way that judges are approaching a problem. And that if you look at any judicial opinion, what you will see is a difference of approach. Now, not in terms of approach with political preferences. No justice, no judge starts his or her opinion with, what does this political party want? What is best for that politician, what do I think as a blank Republican, Democrat, Libertarian, however you want to fill in that blank, what do I think the answer should be? That's not how we go about our craft. In our craft, we approach it from certain starting points, and we differ sometimes in those starting points. There are statutory toolboxes, rules that help us determine what we think the answer should be. And occasionally we disagree in which tool is most important to answer a particular question. But we're all using the same toolbox. And we're coming to our answers in how we craft our answers. And so for me, that's part of civic education. It's teaching students to look at written opinions and to analyze how the judge is approaching that problem. And ultimately, for you as a citizen to look at the judge to see if they're consistent with the views they're espousing. You know, my colleague Sandra Day O'Connor once said that there isn't a judge in the world who wants to be viewed as arbitrary. It's very hard to live with yourself when you perceive yourself as being A, fickle, or B, capricious, or C, king or queen-like. It's a very hard thing to live with. And most judges don't approach their problems that way. They approach them, as I explained, from a sense of duty about how they believe legal questions should be answered. And so for me, educating the public on that, encouraging the public to engage in reading our decisions, I would venture to say that for many people who thought an outcome was good, that if they read a dissenting opinion, they will pause. Whether their mind is changed or not, they will still pause to recognize that there are strong arguments on the other side, that those arguments point to the weaknesses in a majority's conclusion, and that neither side, as I explained earlier, is acting from any sense of bad faith, but for a real commitment to getting the law right.
Justice Gorsuch, what about that? How do we convey exactly what Justice Sotomayor said to the American public? How does civics education help us get that point across about the role of a judge and what judges do in that craft that Justice Sotomayor described?
Yeah, I agree with everything Justice Sotomayor just said. And, you know, for me, I'll go back to those numbers I mentioned a moment ago to just flesh it out a little bit more. So you give us the 70 hardest cases in the whole country to decide every year. We only take those where there's real disagreement in the lower courts, where other judges have gone hammer and tong, because guess what? There are good arguments on both sides of the law. It's a hard case. Most cases aren't hard. You give us the 70 toughest cases a year, and we manage, again, with 9 of us, to resolve those without any disagreement 40% of the time. And the rest of the time, as Justice Sotomayor pointed out, if there's a dissent, it might be really good. And it just might turn out to be right later, too. Often enough, the Supreme Court, years later, turns around and recognizes that dissent was really the wise view of the law and the right view of the law. And maybe we acted too hastily. Maybe we missed something. So the notion that because we disagree, we're doing it politically or for any other reason than we think this is the best view of the law, I just think is belied by history. It's belied by what we do every day. The disagreements we have are legal disagreements. And when we agree, people are sometimes shocked that Justice Sotomayor and I agree. You know, or sometimes it's just the two of us who agree.
And the rest are just plain wrong, Neil.
That's per se say evidence that everybody else is wrong. But sometimes it's just the two of us, or maybe a third. That doesn't mean that the other side's acting in bad faith or doing anything other than giving their best shot at the law. And you gave us a really tough problem, and we're doing the best we can with it. And if you want to assume bad motives, go right ahead. But I'd be more apt to assume that somebody's trying awful hard, loves his country a lot, and is doing their level best and just might be mistaken. And your view might prevail in 50 years or 5, someday later. So don't give up hope. But I just haven't met many people who go into the business of judging, who give up practices of law and other opportunities for bad reasons. They're people who love the country and who want to serve it, and who love their communities and want to be a part of it. Those are the people I've met day in and day out in the trenches in courtrooms across the country, and that's true in our court as well.
Justice Gorsuch, I couldn't agree more with your characterization of, certainly the judges that I've met over the years in communities all across this country care deeply about democracy and the strength of our democracy, as the two of you clearly do. Your passion on this, Justice Gorsuch, is very clear, and I know it's not something that you have come to only lately. And so I would love to hear a bit more about what you have been able to do over the years to try to help promote civics education, civic literacy in this country, and what judges can be doing. What more can judges be doing in their communities across the country to meet what we all now agree is an urgent imperative?
Well, as you know, Justice Sotomayor works with iCivics, and I work with the Constitution Center in a similar capacity. I also work with Colonial Williamsburg in that same capacity too. Another resource, wonderful online opportunities. You can listen to Thomas Jefferson debate James Madison on the Virginia Bill of Rights and fun things like that, and really learn a lot about our history in the process and the people who made it. So I've done a variety of things, and what more importantly, what can other people do? And I think that one good thing that's happening now, another reason why I'm optimistic, is that my friends across the country, judges across the country, are recognizing that they have a role to play here, and that they are uniquely situated, nonpartisan, public servants who are spending their lives to support and defend the Constitution, and that they have to do something, because the teachers, the schools, it's not happening the way it used to, and they are stepping up. In my home state of Colorado, Justice Sotomayor came out a few years back to help dedicate a learning center in the Colorado Supreme Court, where students come in busloads, or they did before the pandemic, and I hope will after, with all sorts of interactive tools to learn about not just the US Constitution, but the Colorado Constitution and their history. So I think judges in courtrooms are starting to do things like that, innovative approaches. Judge Katzman on the Second Circuit is trying very much to do the same sort of thing, of taking judges into classrooms around New York City and bringing classrooms to judges. And I strongly encourage that kind of work. And Justice Sotomayor and I recently spoke with that outfit in New York, and I hope other people model what Bob Katzman's doing up there.
Justice Sotomayor, I know you have been very involved with iCivics and Civics Now, and I'd be curious about the degree to which judges and the legal community at large, can benefit from the resources and the work that you all are doing.
When I started as a Supreme Court justice, I tell people I had 3 huge mail collecting bins outside my office. There were 3 more down in the mailroom waiting for me. And they all contained, most of them, some congratulatory letters, but most of them invitations for me to come speak. I took a year sorting through those letters and trying to respond to them. But I took a year to sort of break it up into groups that were asking me to come speak and to make a decision about, I took that year to think about what was important to me. And what I realized is that what I wanted my legacy to be as a Supreme Court justice was one in which I impacted young people, because I really believe in their power to affect change long-term. And so for me, devoting myself to public speaking, engagement with young people from, by the way, as early as Head Start programs, because I've been to some of those, through professional trainings of all kinds, I speak to students on all levels. And often it's about the court, it's about our system of government, it's about civic engagement, it's about all the topics related to the issues we're talking about today. And iCivics was a natural position for me to step into when my colleague Sandra Day O'Connor was ending her active role in the court and in our society generally. And so iCivics asked me to join the board, and I've been dedicated to that board ever since, and quite active in the outreach programs it's undertaken in the last few years to encourage and expand civic education throughout the United States. iCivics has been a leader in organizing groups involved in civic education to come together and to talk about how best to educate our students, but also how best to educate our society. And so for me, that role has been a critically important one. I have been so admirous of my friend and brother, Bob Katzman, on the Second Circuit, because he has led and put together the National Coalition of Judges to find more diverse ways to do outreach than had been traditionally done. For years, judges would let students come in and do a mock trial, a make-believe trial. I did that when I was on the courts below. Students would come in twice a year from schools, public schools around the city, and try Goldilocks in front of them. It was always fun, okay? And so mock trials do teach something about the court system and about civics. But Bob has expanded that outreach into so many different ways and different fora, and with judges becoming involved in a wide variety of pursuits and activities. And he did it by challenging, he was then chief judge of the Second Circuit, which included the district courts in Connecticut, Vermont, and New York. And he asked each of the district courts to come up with a plan for civic engagement. And every one of them met his challenge, and each one of it did it in a diverse way. Now, if all and many judges across the country are following this model, one that, like Justice Gorsuch, I encourage them to look at all of the options that are available. But I think that if all lawyers and lawyers groups understood that this was their personal moral obligation, moral and legal obligation, because we as citizens, scholars, because that's what lawyers are. Lawyers are the scholars of our Constitution, of our system of government. If we undertake to participate actively in educating others about our system of government and our laws, then we will become a better informed society. And I don't think it takes just bar association. It requires a personal commitment of each lawyer, of their law firms, of their places of business, whether it's a government office or a private office of lawyers. We can all serve in different ways, because civic participation doesn't require you to be a lawyer. It doesn't require you to be a politician. It requires you only to be interested in creating a better world. And that could be done in so many different ways, big and small. And so I challenge everyone, lawyer and non-lawyer, to raise their hand. What are you doing? How are you making a difference? If you can't answer that question, then you're doing something wrong.
So we have a lot of young people watching this session. And Justice Sotomayor, you just issued a challenge, but what would be your message to these young people who are trying to think critically about the information they get, and how they can get involved in civic matters and even help heal some of the divisions we face in their own communities, in their states, and at the national level?
You know, we adults have not done a very good job in the world we're leaving you. As you look at it, you probably could get discouraged by thinking of all the problems that abound, whether it's wars, health crises, crises in our justice system, in the environment. We can turn around and all you can do is see problems. And you could turn away discouraged. So what is it that gives us hope? For me, it's you. We've messed it up, we adults. We haven't found the solution to these problems. I have confidence that you can do a better job than we can do. That with your interest, your participation, your understanding of how important your role is, that you can actually create a better world. And so my message for you is the one I give myself when I get discouraged. You know, when those majority people, those other 5 guys or ladies don't agree with me, sometimes it can be sad. I want to take them and shake them and tell them, what's wrong with you? Why can't you see reason? And often they don't, and I lose. And then I write a dissent and I tell them why they're wrong. And as Neil said, maybe later, a later court will understand I was right. But I don't give up. And I don't give up because I really believe that that's not a choice. It's not a choice for you to give up, because that's being that bystander waiting for the bus to hit you. Your choice is to avoid that bus as best as you can and to take on the world by being interested. So please, keep my hope alive. Stay interested.
Justice Gorsuch?
Yeah, I want to follow up on that. So how do you do that, right? How do you get involved? What difference can you make? I think Justice Sotomayor's life, my life, if there's something we can maybe distill out of it that might be useful to you, is to live life deliberately. I think when you're young, things feel like they happen to you and that you don't have a lot of choice or control over a lot of things that are going on in your life. And that remains true, sad to say, throughout your whole life. I don't always get my way on the court. I'm sometimes writing a dissent. I just wrote one today, and I want to shake my colleagues. But the fact of the matter is, if you let life just happen to you, the bus hits you. It will. It will. But there is an opportunity for all of us to figure out what we're passionate about, what we really care about, what we love, what matters to us, and to start making our choices to live our lives deliberately around those things. Maybe we're a tad selfish. Maybe we need our reactive impulses is for ourselves. Maybe we need to work on that. Maybe our reactive impulse is to assume that people we disagree with act in bad faith, and we need to work on that. Maybe we don't think we can get to where we want to go in life. Work on that. I had some friends who, one of them told me he wanted to be a professional skier when I was young. I didn't know such a thing existed. I couldn't believe it. I said, nobody can do that. Well, he has spent his whole life being a professional skier, and I'm deeply envious of him. I feel like I made a wrong turn because I didn't believe that was a thing. It is a thing, turns out. And it's quite a happy life. So I just say to you, figure out what your passion is, and then don't let anyone stop you. That doesn't mean you can run roughshod over people or be the boss. No. But work on yourself and find ways to get from here to there. And if all of us do that and try and be our best selves, we raise the ship. It helps the country. It helps our families, and it's good for us. And that is the American dream. So I encourage you to grab it and make it happen.
Justice Gorsuch, Justice Sotomayor, thank you so much for giving us your time, your inspiration, and your enlightenment. It was really an amazing conversation on a very busy day in time. You know, in his 2019 year-end report, Chief Justice Roberts recounted how John Jay's involvement in what became the Federalist Papers was cut short because of a rock thrown by a rioter, motivated by rumor. He went on, of course, to express his concern that, quote, in the ensuing years, we've come to take democracy for granted and civic education has fallen by the wayside. In our age, when social media can instantly spread rumor and false information on a grand scale, he said, the public's need to understand our government and its protections it provides is ever more vital. The judiciary has an important role to play in civic education. The two of you have made it quite clear that neither of you have grown complacent about the state of our democracy. Your commitment to educating the public, even beyond your service on the court, is evidenced by your willingness to take time today to have this conversation with us. We are so grateful. CSIS and NSI would also like to thank our event partners, iCivics, the ABA Standing Committee on Law and National Security, and the Liberty and Law Center. And we at CSIS would especially like to thank Craig Newmark Philanthropies for generously supporting our strategic dialogue on civics education as a national security imperative. And again, more information on this can be found at the Civics as a National Security Imperative project page at csis.org. Jamil, you get the last word.
Thanks, Suzanne, and thanks to you, Justices Gorsuch and Sotomayor, for being here with us today. What an amazing opportunity for young people to hear your passion, your commitment to the rule of law, your commitment to our democracy and the Constitution of the United States. Thanks also to our co-sponsors, including CSIS, the ABA Standing Committee on Law and National Security, iCivics, and the Law and Liberty Center at George Mason University's Antonin Scalia Law School. And in particular, special thanks to all the young people and the larger audience out there for being with us here today and for spending time. Thanks for watching. Have a great rest of the day.